Okay, so we're moving along here in Arthur Young's Reflexive Universe. Um, we're up to chapter 8, but we're up to the plant kingdom now, which represents stage, what is it, 5 in his sevenfold model, the principle of growth. Um, these are the characteristics that he says that life has. And here, too, with Arthur Young, as with Aurobindo, the emergence of life from matter becomes problematic, and neither explanation is very convincing. Um, Young says that life then has the principle of negative entropy. It can store energy, hierarchy, increase of order or organization. One degree of freedom now has been reattained because of the radial symmetry that plants have as they grow up vertically. Size and growth, self reproduction, and evolution. And so life, he says, proceeds by division. It has the capacity to self replicate and divide its cells, um, which is correct, but it doesn't take into account the fact that what makes life life, as opposed to the molecular world that we've been investigating, is now the presence of souls. These first bacteria, uh, let's take a look at his grid before we get into one more time just to remind ourselves of where we're at here. Okay, so what we're going to look at through this sequence as he has it here, all the way down there at level 5. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you've got the vegetable world. Where going across the principle of potential is bacteria, and then the principle of binding now is algae. That is to say, he makes a distinction between single-celled organisms and multi-celled organisms. Start binding together. Plants create then embryophytes, which gives them an identity because they can produce embryos now at this point. Saliphites have invented vascular tissue that handles their nutrients. That's the principle of combination. And then Calamites, we're back to, if you look at the level above, to polymerization. Calamites are segmented. They represent the principle of growth within the plant kingdom. Segmentation, or in the molecular world, polymerization. They're all the same thing. And then finally, with the production of gymnosperms that correspond to mobility because their seeds the wind can carry their seeds away. And then finally, angiosperms, which are the flowers, which represent dominion. So that's the sequence that we're going to go through. All right, so let's go ahead and look then at where he starts his model with bacteria. Bacteria are the first living things on the planet. They're still debating exactly when it comes in. Variously, it seems to be it's definitely in the Archean. So we have the Hadean period. And here's another thing. Arthur Young is a spatial thinker. He does not think in terms of temporality like I do. I'm a time thinker. So it matters what thing comes in at what point chronologically, as far as I'm concerned, with the evolution of consciousness and living things. So bacteria come in somewhere between 3.4 billion years ago and maybe 4 or 3.8, right in there. The Hadean period is with the formation of the Earth about 4.6 billion years ago. The planet Theia crashes into it at 4.5 billion and forms the moon out of that. And then we get the late heavy bombardment where the Earth is pummeled with asteroids bringing water in the form of frozen ice crystals that then melt to form the ocean. That takes place between 4.1 and about 3.8 or even 3.5, this bombardment. So you can't have life without water. So those asteroids are bringing the ocean in, and once it's there, now you can have single-celled organisms. In other words, monads. I'm calling bacteria souls because everything that's alive has a soul. So these are monads now that start incarnating as these single-celled organisms. And there are several types of them. The earliest is probably the methanogenic type that still today live in our guts, that emerged down near thermoplasmic vents in the ocean. While the Earth is being bombarded, they're kind of safe and cozy and warm down there. and that's where they come from. And then almost immediately another generation happens, probably when the bombardment is finished, because these ones can go up to the surface now, and they are cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria that now invent photosynthesis. So they invent photosynthesis. They harness sunlight as energy to take H2O and, or rather CO2, because they want the carbon. So they clip off. They use that energy from the sunlight to clip off, and then chlorophyll is what enables them to do this. Clip off the carbon, and there goes the oxygen. And eventually, this will lead to a major catastrophe, the oxygen catastrophe. Other little bacteria guys will then have to come along, called aerobic bacteria, to handle oxygen. So they come along to handle oxygen. And then Lynn Margulis was the genius who figured all this out, that these cells later become taken up endosymbiotically in larger cells. For example, chloroplasts in plant cells are these original cyanobacteria. They have a different DNA. So this is provable. They have a different DNA than what's in the nucleus. So we know they were separate free-living organisms at one time. But now they're chloroplasts inside plant cells that give them the ability to photosynthesize. And the same thing with our mitochondria. In our cells are these aerobic bacteria that could handle oxygen. And those are what give animals the ability to respire oxygen. So these are very inventive little creatures. And so we have currently now 5 kingdoms. And Jung discusses this as he's talking about this first phase, that we have 5 kingdoms. Originally it was just, as Rudolf Steiner has it, it's just plants and animals, which is overly simplistic because bacteria are something else. That they clearly deserve their own kingdom, and so they have it. But they are prokaryotic. They're not nucleated cells. Once we get nucleated cells, we move to eukaryotic cells, which is the kingdom of the protists, some of which are still single-celled, but most protists are multicellular. Let's take a look at this guy here. He's one of my favorites. The euglena. I like this guy because he upsets everybody's expectations for whether this is a plant or an animal. It's a eukaryote because it has a nucleated cell there. You can see in the center, but it's got a flagellum for a tail that enables it to whip about, and it has chloroplasts in it so that it can photosynthesize. But it also eats. It also has the ability to eat. Heterotrophically, I think it's called. So it's kind of what Derrida would call an undecidable, let's say. Where does it belong? So we have to have another kingdom. In addition to prokaryotic bacteria, now we have to have the eukaryotic world, some of which is single-celled, like this guy is single-celled. But for Arthur Young, the point is that it's multicellular. Once we get to the multicellular realm, we're moving up the chain of being. And of course, he's right. So let's take a look at his model. And fungi have their own model, rather their own kingdom. So you have the bacteria and you have the protists, and then you have the fungi in addition to just regular plants and animals. Fungi are really a type of plant. They don't deserve their own kingdom just because they don't photosynthesize. Nonetheless, they are plant-like in essence. They grow out of the ground. And the guy that he quotes from here, that he's some guy named Bold, his last name Bold, the book is The Plant Kingdom. He divides the plant kingdom and he includes fungi within it as a special type of plant, which I would do. I wouldn't give them their own kingdom. They're basically plant-like. But now, so for the second stage now, which is the principle of binding, the first stage is always that of potential. So we've got bacteria up and running. Now we have multicellular organisms, which is important for Arthur Young here. And these are algae here. And algae go way, way back. They are groups of these cyanobacteria that know how to photosynthesize, and they gather together to form these multicellular algal mats, let's say. We have different kinds here. Ectocarpus, Laminaria, Corda, Fucus, Nereocystis, Alaria. And these are very, very early. They go back about 3 billion years into the Archean, and they're water. Note that everything comes out of water. These are water plants. Okay, and so that represents the principle of binding. That stage does. So as we move to the next stage, which is the stage now of the formation of an identity, we have land plants. These are the first land plants. They're called Embryophytes, and they originate during the Cambrian about 500 million years ago. So plants are ahead of animals as far as coming out of the water and moving things along. And these are the first land plants, Sporophytes, Marcanthia, and so forth. So forth. The key thing about them and what gives them the principle of identity is now they have embryos. So they have these little, they have to be fertilized with a sperm and an egg. Let's see, and he gives this little diagram here of how they're called embryophytes because they have a little chamber there, and you can see on the left there, a sperm has to enter this chamber, which is separated off by a cluster of cells in order to fertilize the egg. So that's why they're called embryophytes. They have their own embryos. Okay, so then let's take a look at the next phase here in Jung's model, which brings us up to the Saliphites. And now the thing with Saliphites is that they originate in the Silurian epoch, which is 430 million years ago, about that. And they represent the principle of combination here. They invent vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, which conduct fluid and food through the plant, and thus make possible an increase in size now. So Jung doesn't pay, it's interesting that he doesn't pay attention to chronology, but the chronology fits his model. These 7 stages do occur over time chronologically as life gets more and more complex. So let's take a look at the Calamites then, which originate during the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous is one of my favorite epochs because it's absolute insanity. The Carboniferous is called that because it's where we get all our fossil fuels from these forests. And they're made of these things here called Calamites, which now represent the principle on his model of segmentation, polymerization. So they represent the where is it, the 5th substage, that of growth. And some of these things were, the forests in the Carboniferous were made out of these things. Some of them were 90 feet tall. And there was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere at that time, and as a result of that, the world's largest insects that ever lived, you had scorpions the size of dogs. There were dragonflies that were enormous, flying around like kites, monstrous centipedes. The Carboniferous is really the age of the dominance of insects, which I believe have been in an evolutionary struggle with vertebrates all along. Arthropods versus vertebrates. It's been going on for a very long time. There are reptiles coming in during the Carboniferous, but they're still pretty small, and they're probably preyed upon quite a bit by these monstrosities, these insect monstrosities. Okay, so that's Calamites, and now we're moving up to the Middle Devonian period, 390 million years ago, which is another cool period because it has monstrous fish that I love, gigantic fish. And then so the Gymnosperms then come in. So the Gymnosperms represent then the principle of mobility because these plants now have seeds, and they're the first plants to have seeds. Cycads, ginkgos, red pines, cypress, hemlock. They're the first seed-bearing plants, he says. And the term gymnosperm means that the seeds of these plants are naked. That is to say, they're not enclosed in an ovary. And so having seeds now corresponds to the principle of mobility. But it's the next one up, the Angiosperms, that is the dominion. And rightfully so, and obviously so, the realm of flowers, Angiosperms. Flowers don't come in until the Cretaceous, and they come in the early Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago, during the 3rd dinosaur epoch there, after Triassic and Jurassic. And grass also did not come in until the Cretaceous, and it came in near the end of it. just before the asteroid hit, somewhere around 70 million years ago. So, and they're called angiosperms. Angio means vessel seed, and so that distinguishes it from the gymnosperms in that the seed has a covering to it now. And so we get the wonderful world of flowering plants. And he gives this last little diagram here, his diagram of the 7 levels that correspond to a flower. And so inside this we have the sepal, which is at the bottom there on the left hand side, and above that are the petals, and then above that are within that are the sex organs. The stamen there corresponds to the penis, more or less. It contains the pollen, and the pistil would correspond to the vagina. It's in the middle there, and so then down inside of it we have the ovary on the right hand side there. The diagram continues with the ovary, then ovules, number 5, which are within there, and 6 is the gametophyte, and then 7 is the egg nucleus. So the plant an insect has to get the pollen from the stamens and get it over to the pistil so that it can go down and flower. And he does make an interesting point here about this idea of purposiveness. And of course, the whole thing is purposive. Nothing happens randomly. We're done with Darwin. We just forget about that. That kind of, the world is not an accident. And even though Arthur Young doesn't, like I say, he's just sort of in between, let's say, Stephen Hawking on the one hand as a materialist and Aurobindo and Steiner on the other as spiritualists. He's somewhere in between. But nonetheless, he recognizes that there's purposiveness here, because he says that, notice that he's talking about the gymnosperms, and he says that the sperm is quite a bit separated from the egg. He says in moss, well, one might think that these would be placed close together, but in moss the sperm must swim to the top of a long pointed archegonium. And so why isn't it the case, he asks, that the sperm and the egg are close together? And his answer is, the journey of the sperm to the egg is the purposive stage of process, and I believe this separation of sperm and egg is an evolutionary device to ensure that purposiveness rather than accident start each new generation. Brilliant insight, and I think that it definitely applies. There is nothing random about any of this, and spiritual beings are involved in all of this, just as Rudolf Steiner says. He's got it right, and also Aurobindo. So let's bring it back here. Something is still on. This is on, and this is on. Okay, bring it back to moi. There we are. And so that's this chapter. I think it's quite brilliant. And so I plugged in all the dates so you can see how plants do become more and more complex over time, almost as though Gymnosperms, the giant trees, and Angiosperms, the flowers, were the goal all along. And then so it has reached that goal. Now, Aurobindo has this idea, which is interesting, where he thinks that evolution is done except for humans. He thinks that plants, and this is kind of an illustration of it, because the flowering plants are the end here of the story at this point, and we're still in the Cretaceous 125 million years ago. So what did plants do after that? They didn't do anything. They just keep going. So they've reached what Aurobindo calls the type. So they have fulfilled their evolution. They've gotten to where they wanted to go. He thinks the same thing about animals as well. I'm not quite sure that's true. He doesn't think that they are evolving any longer either. They've also reached their type, or let's say fulfilled the type. Only humans, both psychologically and physically, have still room for more evolution. This is according to Aurobindo. And for the descent of the supramental, then, that will change consciousness and actually change our bodies physically. So it'll produce a whole new species. So interesting to sort of supplement Young's model here with Orobindo. Okay, next we'll look at Young's model of animals.